The other day I counted it up. I've been to 4 public elementary schools, 4 public middle schools, 2 public high schools, and 1 public university. I've taught in a public high school in Louisiana for 3 years after I graduated college. And while teaching, I got involved in my teachers' union and their fight against ITEP, or the Industrial Tax Exemption Program. Basically, we went to our school board, the East Baton Rouge Parish School Board, and fought against them giving tax breaks to huge oil companies like Exxon. At the time, I thought it was ridiculous that these multinational corporations were paying zero property tax, and these are tax dollars that should have gone to our local public schools. I should add that Louisiana was the only state that allowed school boards to have such discretion. While other union members, organizers, parish employees, and others were debating at a school board meeting, someone got up and said that ITEP was bad, sure, but it was nothing compared to the money we were losing to charter schools. Now, at this point, the tax breaks on these very expensive corporate properties over decades was calculated to be over $30 million. I thought, how could charter schools be costing the district more than that? What I've been researching since then has changed my entire view of the American public school system, and honestly, some of the things I found out make me wish I had never learned them. However, corruption has been thriving in our ignorance. I wanted to make this video about something that is important to me, and this issue is important to me. And what's going on with schools in Baton Rouge area is a perfect example of how cities and towns are being divided so that America's schools can be sold off and resegregated, and I wish I was exaggerating on both of those terms. But as I've been researching the story, I've realized that there were so many layers, far too many layers to cover in just one sitting. So I bring to you now part 1 of my educational justice series, the origin of public schools and the movement to privatize them. As usual, I will attach a transcribed version of this essay with the work cited in the description below. There have been public schools in the United States for almost as long as there were Americans, the colonists, although they don't look much like our conception of the public schools today. Now, the first official British colony in the United States, Jamestown, was founded in 1607, and less than 1 generation later, in 1635, the township of Boston established what is the oldest continuous public school, Boston Latin School, predating Harvard College by more than a year. The first free taxpayer-supported public school in North America, the Mather School, was opened in Massachusetts in 1639. In 1642, the Massachusetts Bay Colony passed a law declaring that all children must be taught to read and write. Again, the primary concern was the lack of Bible reading, and again, citizens were using the law to more efficiently reach the heathen population. By 1647, the General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony decreed that every town of 50 families should have an elementary school, and every town of 100 families should have a Latin school. But at this point, the schools were still mostly parochial, and while some were free in order to boost conversion rates and keep constituents indoctrinated, there was no infrastructure designed around the idea that the masses should be educated. There was a new idea that government intervention could intercede and improve education and literacy rates, but concrete plans and models for how such a system would be managed and funded were not yet in place. Outside of the realm of colonist control, British colonist control, at the Ursuline Convent in New Orleans in 1727, the Sisters of the Order of St. Ursula founded the oldest continuously operating school for girls and also the oldest Catholic school in the United States. But even more notably, the Ursuline nuns did not discriminate based on class or background. Their belief that the development of women was essential to civilizing society and the need for literacy and the conversion to Catholicism allowed all students from the children of slaves to Native Americans, Catholic Hispanic girls, and women from socially privileged families in Central and South American countries. Then, in 1787, the Northwest Ordinance was enacted by the Congress of the Confederation of the United States that created the Northwest Territory, the first organized territory of the United States. It established the precedents by which the federal government would create new states and not just expand on old ones, and also set a legislative precedent in regard to American public domain lands. The ways in which it outlines statehood and land ownership are historical on their own, but I'm going to skip that to focus on how it called for a public university as a part of the settlement and eventual statehood in the Northwest Territory. So the authors stated, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged, marking this the first time that American government endorses public education and the first time it provides any resources, land, to subsidize that cause. And a basis for school systems was developing within the states too. In New York, a 1795 law authorized spending £20,000 annually for 5 years to support schools. The state aid was matched by local taxes. In Massachusetts in 1789, they passed a law requiring all towns to hire schoolmasters, and in 1800, they enabled towns to levy taxes to fund such a thing. However, the concept of free schools did not match the execution, and if the cost of instruction exceeded the total cost of state aid plus local tax, as it generally did, the difference was made up by charging tuition or rates itemized on rate bills. To put it in context, the United States was still writing the first legislature on property tax, and those laws were in their first stages of implementation. In some states, all property, with few exceptions, was taxed. In others, specific objects were named. Land was taxed in one state according to quantity, in another according to quality, and in a third not at all. Responsibility for the assessment and collection of taxes in some cases attached to the state itself and others to the counties or townships. Delaware did not tax property, only the income from it. By 1796, state and local governments in 14 of the 15 states taxed land, but only 4 taxed inventory. In the period from 1796 to the beginning of our Civil War, the American system of state and local taxation was being established. It is the taxation of all property, movable and immovable, visible and invisible, or real and personal, as we say in America, at one uniform rate. This is the only direct tax known in most of our commonwealths, and it is only recently that certain special forms of taxation have assumed greater importance in some of our state budgets than this. Horace Mann, who became the first secretary of the Massachusetts State Board of Education in 1837, is credited with starting the Common Schools movement. The Common School movement was an effort that began in the early 1800s, and it sought to provide free education to all students regardless of wealth, heritage, or class. So the original Department of Education was created in 1867, and then the passage of the Second Morrill Act in 1890 gave the then-named Office of Education responsibility for administering support for the original system of land-grant colleges and universities. And now we see a pattern emerging in the supposed purpose of education throughout history. Education's primary purpose has ranged from instructing youth in religious doctrine, to preparing them to live in a democracy, to assimilating immigrants into mainstream society, to preparing workers for the industrialized 20th century workplace. And this led to questions about the role of education in the future. What did state-funded education seek to do? To create adults who can compete in a global economy? To create lifelong learners? To create emotionally healthy adults who can engage in meaningful relationships? To develop citizens who are informed and socially conscious? Whatever the purpose was, the United States was now laying the groundwork for true, free, at the point of delivery public education. This progressive movement had seriously expanded schooling so that by the 1940s, about half of young adults had earned their high school diploma. There was still this huge fight over segregation looming ahead, but the United States was far ahead of its peers in reaching the masses with accessible education. Then in 1955, Milton Friedman wrote The Role of Government in Education. In his recommendation on public policy, he conceded the need for government-subsidized schools. His objection to public schools as they currently existed was their potential for indoctrination, and how those who were less well off could not afford alternatives to the state-sponsored standard education. His proposal for a voucher system that would privatize state schools where the market allowed. Milton's plan was simple. I quote, "Governments could require a minimum level of education which they could finance by giving parents vouchers redeemable for a specific maximum sum per child per year if spent on approved educational services. Parents would then be free to spend this sum and any additional sum on purchasing educational services from an approved institution of their own choice. The educational services could be rendered by private enterprises operated for profit or by nonprofit institutions of various kinds. The role of government would be limited to assuring that the schools met certain minimum standards, such as the inclusion of a minimum common content in their programs, much as it now inspects restaurants to ensure that they maintain minimum sanitary standards. In this way, government's role in education was reduced to one of regulation and would provide a stipend for which private schools would compete. The end goal was to introduce innovation through competition into the stagnant state-controlled market of education. It would also enable parents to make more choices about their children's education, and Friedman also thought that this would combat the state-sponsored indoctrination. Some of the points in this public policy recommendation are compelling. There was a state monopoly on education, or at least a de facto one at the time, and it's not necessarily a bad idea to introduce competition to improve a product. However, before I move on with this discussion, I do want to offer my own analysis or framework, just so it does not seem like I am endorsing this particular public policy. Privatization, or introducing the profit incentive, makes sense when efficiency of production and quality of the product coincide. For example, a state might introduce competition in selecting contractors for mail carriers to see who can most cheaply and quickly deliver a set amount of mail. In this case, the product, the swiftly delivered mail, is the same as the method of increasing efficiency, i.e., creating the profit. But the education of human beings doesn't follow this business model, and the normal production strategies that increase efficiency and therefore increase profit do not work. For example, scale of production or increasing the amount of products made in order to reduce overhead doesn't work in education. Teacher-to-student ratio is a huge predictor of student success, as are small class sizes and close-knit school communities. Uniformity of product is another way to reduce costs and improve efficiency, but education does not follow a one-size-fits-all model. It works best whenever it has many different programs tailored to individuals. Production costs can also be suppressed by reducing the autonomy of workers and increasing the specialization of labor. But education improves when teachers have autonomy and training in many different disciplines. Finally, education also doesn't really translate to a profit model, not when there's a huge initial cost and a long time before the individual or society reaps the revenue of developed human capital. I'm not saying that private or parochial schools are inherently bad or that good education can be profitable, but this proposal of competition as a total solution to the problems of education simply is not sufficient. So, Friedman's ideas were not the only ones that contributed to the charter school movement. In 1974, Ray Budd, a World War II veteran and an education professor at the University of Massachusetts, expanded on Friedman's idea. So, Friedman had outlined a voucher system, but he hadn't really imagined beyond public or private schools. It was Budd who married the idea with school districts. He proposed that states grant charters to create new experimental programs and departments in existing school districts. However, those men's ideas were not immediately used to influence public policy in a stagnant education system. It wasn't until the provocative 1983 report, A Nation at Risk, that school choice and chartering were seriously considered as policy options. Albert Shanker, a union organizer for the American Federation of Teachers, gave a response to A Nation at Risk in a speech in 1988, where he advocated the idea of charter schools. His vision saw a system which would allow for freedom for variation, and I think it's important to note his later renouncement of the school choice movement and what it became. His initial proposal of a plan for faculty decision-making, for participative management, team teaching, a way for a teaching team to govern itself, and a provision that shows how much a subunit should be organized so that the teachers would no longer be isolated in the classroom throughout their professional lives, but would have the time to be available to share ideas and talk and with each other. It could not sound further than the conditions of current for-profit charter schools. Schenker's original vision was more closely aligned with a democratically run school where the will of teachers, parents, and students would be heard and enacted. He conceived schools where teachers were allowed to try new strategies and cooperate with districts, and therefore they would need to have strong union membership. But today, just 12% of charter schools are unionized, and teacher retention rates, one possible measure of a professional satisfaction, are much lower than in traditional public schools. In fact, nationwide, charter schools lose 24% of their teachers each year at about double the rate of traditional public schools. Charter schools have on average less certified and less experienced teachers as well. In that same year, Paul T. Hill would author a report endorsing charter schools, but again, his idealistic version does not match the reality we see today. Schenker and Hill both cautioned for strict control of these charter schools, since parental choice would be the only barrier between a student and their education. Hill's report had a chapter entitled Protecting Children from School Failure that said of charter schools, they must offer protection for children whose school fails despite all the pressures for high performance. Even though parents could withdraw children to send them somewhere else, that requires parental vigilance, a not guarantee. And what if there are no other successful schools where the student can attend? This caution also bears out, as today about 200 charter schools close each year, and not just for academic shortcomings, but for flawed governance and leadership, a drop in student demand, or financial miscalculations. Possibly the biggest inversion of Schenker and Hill's version of charter schools is how, in the discourse around school choice, charter schools are almost always framed in competition with school districts, as punishment for schools and school systems when they cannot or do not achieve on their own. The framing of charter schools as punitive, a corrective action, is partially why their deployment as an educational strategy has been most intense in decimated communities. Detroit and New Orleans are good examples of gutted educational systems almost completely turned over to private interests, one being ravaged by economics and the other by a natural disaster, and both paved the way for a private takeover of public schools. Following Schenker and Hill's recommendations, the first charter school law was passed in 1991 in Minnesota, and the first charter school was established there in 1992. By 1995, an additional 18 states had passed charter school legislation, and from the 2003 to 2004 and on to the 2013-2014 school year, the number of charter schools in the United States doubled, growing from 3,000 to 6,000, and the proportion of students enrolled in the schools increasing from 1.6 to 5.1%. In a Wall Street Journal op-ed 3 months after Katrina, Milton Friedman again championed his idea of a voucher system. Most New Orleans schools are in ruins, as are the homes of the children who have attended them. The children are now scattered all over the country. This is a tragedy. It is also an opportunity to radically reform the educational system. The Bush administration seized on this idea. It poured millions into charter schools, and the New Orleans system was quickly auctioned off long before the majority of residents returned home. Only 4 schools in the whole district remained official traditional public schools. The New Orleans Teachers Union contract was shredded, and its 4,700 members were all fired. This move, at the turn of the millennium, marks a shift in American education policy, one that is incredibly dangerous. Once heralded as beacons of innovation and collaboration, designed to work with districts and not in competition with districts, now charter schools are allowing the private sector to divide up public assets and steal them from the public. You should pay attention and subscribe to get notified for the next video where I will explain how charter schools are robbing public school districts, how they are robbing you.